Finding ways to make sure that we're continuing to have regular, meaningful contact with people who are different from ourselves is just so central to the success of the American experiment.
Hey, I'm Kelly Corrigan, and when I was in ninth grade, my history teacher told us the most powerful force on earth is belief. It animates our better angels and our worst instincts. Marry that with the two biggest takeaways from a year of podcasting. One, we are tribal by nature, and two, the antidote is conversation. And well, here we are, kicking off a series on belief. I called up 10 believers, people like Anne Lamott and Rainn Wilson, and asked them 10 questions. What does your faith make you do? What happens when we die? Today, we start the series with Dr. Michael Murray, a philosophy professor and now the president of the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. We'll be right back. Have you ever needed career advice and found yourself getting buried in Google searches? Well, there's a podcast for that. Meet 9 to 5-ish, the career podcast from The Skim. Each week, the co-founders and co-CEOs of The Skim, Carly Zakin and Danielle Weisberg, interview women at the top of their game. And we're digging into all the career questions. Need negotiating advice? Gail King's got you covered. Trying to launch your own business? Bumble's Whitney Wolfe Herd can tell you how. New episodes drop each Wednesday. Follow 9 to 5-ish with The Skim wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, so for busy women who want to look polished and put together but don't have time to deal with uncomfortable clothes, meet Betabrand. Betabrand's dress pant yoga pants are designed with the fit and flexibility of yoga pants, but they look like professional dress pants. They're wrinkle-resistant, machine-washable, super soft and stretchy, so they look good and they feel good all day. Right now, you can get 30% off your Betabrand order when you go to betabrand.com/Kelly. I myself picked out a very groovy pair of pants, and I wear them about 3 times a week. That's at betabrand.com/Kelly for 30% off your Betabrand order at betabrand.com/Kelly. So we got super curious at Kelly Corrigan Wonders about belief because it seems like this foundational element of our country and also the source of much conflict. And we went to Arthur Vining Davis Foundation to talk to them about who they might know who could talk to us and if they would help support our series. And fortunately, they said yes. And so Michael Murray is my guest today. And Michael, will you tell our listeners what you did before you got to Arthur Vining Davis?
Sure. But first, let me say, it's great to be with you, Kelly. You're one of my favorite people in the world. So it's really fun to be able to talk with you about these things. Before I came to Arthur Vining Davis, my first part of my career, I was a philosophy professor for 20 years at Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Did you love it? I feel like you would love that job so much.
Yeah, I loved it. I could go back and do that for the rest of my life and be very happy.
Yeah.
Interacting with students in a really small setting, and getting to know them and wrestling with them about ideas is really, really fun.
And is the modern student super interested in that stuff? Like, was there great engagement?
Really a lot, especially around topics related to faith. The classes that I taught that had something to do with religion just had waiting lists I could never get through. I could teach them in every course, every semester, and they would be full every time.
Do you have a theory why?
I think it's because, although there's a declining percentage of students that are looking at their college experience as an opportunity to explore issues of meaning and purpose, there is still a significant percentage that are looking for that during their time in college. And there are just very few places where that actually goes on in the classroom.
I mean, it's something you have to think through, I think, to be a fully realized person.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's just a topic that is not treated in very many classes. And there's still a lot of faculty who are reluctant to kind of lead students through a conversation about these issues.
Well, that brings me to a new law that I think passed in Oklahoma, which is that you can't teach anything that has the potential to upset or trigger a student. I could imagine that in this new campus culture, it's even harder to talk through religion because it feels like a little bit of a landmine, which is part of the reason why we wanted to do this series.
And yet, it's also true that students really do want to talk about it. They are interested in developing their own religious identity and understanding what other students think. And yet, I will say there's this competing pressure, which I think is growing over time. There's a really interesting piece published in the publication Inside Higher Education by a professor at Tulane named Alana Horowitz. And she had done research at Stanford for a number of years on students' religious identity. And what she found was over the period of her study, students were increasingly reluctant to reveal their religious identity to everyone because they felt like it was frowned upon. It was either viewed as anti-intellectual, or they were seen to be part of a religious group that was associated with various forms of social injustice. So it could be, evangelicals being viewed as favorably disposed towards Trump, or it could be Jewish students who were worried about conversations on campus about Israel and Palestine.
Right. Yes, or pro-choice or pro-life. I mean, there's a lot of ways. Well, I mean, religions are creations of man, and so they're just riddled with human error.
And it's all the more reason why you need to have opportunities for everybody to talk these issues through in dispassionate settings.
Yes, and not with your parents or your grandparents. Like it's such a personal thing, and it often starts inside your family. And we get very little practice in that kind of conversation where you can ask or say anything. And that's really the goal of this whole series, is just to model conversations that are totally curiosity-driven and zero judgment. Just really trying to understand, what do you believe? What does that belief help you do? Where does that belief let you down? Where do you see things in the world that validate your belief, that challenges your belief? So it was super fun to try to come up with the right questions that would help us understand one another without any sense of agenda.
And I think that's why what you're doing is so important.
So this is a sort of foundational idea of our country. And it's quite a project to put on a country to say you can, you have the freedom to believe in whatever you want to believe. And it's often touted. But I wondered if you thought it was really possible, which is to say, like, if you really believe that Jesus was the Son of God, or you really believe that Jesus has not come yet, or you really don't believe in Jesus at all, can you accept and celebrate the beliefs that are total contradiction to your deepest convictions?
That is a really good question. And I think when you look at world history and you look at the writings of political scientists and political philosophers, you'd get pretty pessimistic. It looks like countries or states that have tried to be religiously diverse have fractured. And when you look at the writings of these intellectuals, what you find is that they can't come up with an intellectual defense for toleration. So in the period of philosophy that I study, the 17th and 18th century, there was a lot of hand-wringing about this because there were major religious wars going on in Europe at the time. The 30 Years' War, which dominated the first half of the 17th century, was, among other things, a war between Protestants and Catholics, and up to 8 million people lost their lives in Europe. And as they were emerging from this period, intellectuals were wrestling with the question of how can we justify a posture of tolerance towards those who hold other points of view. And they came up with two sorts of defenses. One more pragmatic, which just said, the interests of the state is really to guard the civil interests of citizens, not these private matters. And so the state should be hands-off when it comes to religious belief, and so should allow as many different religious traditions as there are to flourish in our midst.
Which is not like a moral position they're taking. It's
That's
just
right.
Completely pragmatic.
That's right, completely pragmatic. And then on the other hand, you've got these, what we philosophers call epistemic arguments, where the claim is that, even though individuals within religious traditions might have a high degree of confidence in their own tradition, they have to acknowledge that they might be wrong. And because they might be wrong, they should be open to allowing others who might have the similarly high degree of confidence in their religious traditions to live freely within their midst. But neither of those arguments are very persuasive towards people who are intolerant, because the intolerant will say, we've got the truth, and for those who don't have the truth, they end up in eternal damnation. And that's a really bad thing. So the state has an interest in making sure that those people who have these false beliefs which are almost like a communicable terminal disease, shouldn't be allowed to roam free. Right? These intellectual arguments don't work against the views of the intolerant. And yet, it has worked in the United States so far. So why is that? I think the answer is it's complicated, but perhaps the simplest reason is in most places where there's a high degree of religious diversity, these religious groups are geographically separated. And that's not true in the US. So in the US, when you drive through the center of town or through the city, you see the mosque and the synagogue and the Latter-day Saints congregation and the Baptist church, all on the same strip. And what you find is that kids from these different traditions are going to the public school together and they're engaging in sports with each other. And so there's a lot of social contact. And social contact is social superglue. So we find that in the US, on average, people have two close friends who are from traditions that are different from their own. And within their extended family, they have at least one person who's from a religious tradition that's different from their own. Scientists who study this can show that when you know people from another tradition, your positive sentiment towards them and this other tradition goes up. And we can even measure it.
I remember talking to Norman Lear, and he said that he so admired Modern Family because they had put a really fun gay couple in every household in America. And for many people, Cam and Mitch were their first gay friend. And he said, that's what we did with the Jeffersons, is we put different people in people's homes, and it's exposure theory. Like, it's how you get used to something that you don't know personally, like an interracial couple.
Yes, that was Norman Lear's genius with primetime television. And I mean, social science has continued to bear out the significance of this strategy. So, we're in this period where we're increasingly socially isolated, and social media tends to affiliate us with people who are very similar to us along the different identity markers that we use. And so that's, I think, the real risk. The risk of failure and something that we've succeeded at comes because of social isolation and this increasing digital isolation that we're experiencing. And so finding ways to make sure that we're continuing to have not just dialogue, but regular, meaningful contact with people who are different from ourselves is just so central to the success of the American experiment.
Right. And that's why desegregation that's ended up leading to a different kind of segregation is so problematic. I mean, if you listen to the best thinkers around public education, they'll tell you that the golden era for social contact across groups was in the very beginning of desegregation, before people started to opt out.
That's really true. And the early desegregation movement that involved significant busing, which we don't do much of anymore. As we've now looked back retrospectively at the impact of those programs, they were actually quite successful in a variety of different measures, not least in depolarizing race relations. But we've moved away from that. And, I think we're suffering from some of the consequences.
How is belief beautiful? And how is it super dangerous?
Yeah, those are also good questions. So, belief covers lots of different things, right? But belief here, we really mean religious belief of some sort. And scholars debate a lot about what does religion mean and how do we define it? And it involves this, some kind of a commitment to a reality that transcends the individual and that provides you with a source of moral guidance and individual purpose and motivation for loving and serving others. To me, that's when we're talking about belief, that's the thing we're talking about. And so why is it beautiful? Well, I think there's a variety of reasons. So one is, first of all, religion gets a lot of bad press. And in fact, one of the areas that we support at the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations is local journalism. And so we did a survey a couple of years ago. We asked a national news organization to give us a list of all the stories that they had done on religion in the last year. 90% of them were on one of three topics: terrorism, pedophilia, and bigotry. So that was essentially their Islam, Catholic, and Protestant beats. Religion does get a lot of bad press. There's certainly
everything gets bad press. Like, if it bleeds, it leads. Like, this is the whole thing, is that whatever reason are so much more interested in bad news than good news.
Right. That's what we click on. And yet, what's just fascinating when you look carefully at the social science research on religion, we find that religious people are more generous. They have better quality of relationships. They live longer. There's a lower incidence of mental illness. There's less substance abuse disorders. All these things that are beneficial for us individually and culturally result from higher degrees of religiosity. And that just doesn't get the press.
Mm-mm.
So one reason it's beautiful is because it's good for us and it's good for those who are around us.
I think about my parents a lot. My dad went to church, every day of his life since he was 5 years old. He started in Catholic schools. And even when he worked in New York City for the last 10 years of his career, he still zoomed through St. Patrick's Cathedral for noon mass, got the Eucharist, and then went to like a 3-martini lunch with a client. And for my mom, it's like this winter coat that she's been trying to put on me, for 30 years. Like, come on, it's cold out there. Like, you're going to need this. And for her, it's terrific comfort. And the comfort comes in this very specific way, which is in the shrinking of herself into the whole.
It's for many people, it's a substantial source of significance and meaning. And, it's no surprise to learn that the data indicates that people tend to come back to religion as they age, in part because they're looking for these sources of inspiration and meaning. But it's also good for us, like as I mentioned, socially. Being engaged or involved in religious activities in some way seems to be important when it comes to the social benefits.
Well, one cool question we asked everybody in the series was, what does your religion make you do? What actions do you take that are tied directly to your belief?
I'd love to hear all the answers. I think for those who take their religious convictions really seriously, they think about the implications of those beliefs for the other. I think we live in a culture where, as we secularize, we tend to think of success and money and wealth as kind of a crowning virtue, that something that we have because we've earned it and it's mine. And, maybe I'll give it away if I'm philanthropically inclined, but I don't have an obligation to do that. Whereas for many who come from within various religious traditions, I think there's a sense that I'm a bearer of this gift that's not my own. And much of my good fortune might be due to that. So that I owe it to my creator and I owe it to my neighbor to help improve their fortune, their state.
Yeah. A lot of ideas in religion go back to intellectual humility. Like when we were talking about tolerance, and this can take us into how is religion dangerous. But if you're able to hold in your heart that at the same time that you deeply believe something, it is possible that you are wrong, that is a marker of intellectual humility that could save us all.
I think that's really important, and it's one of the arguments, right, in favor of the importance of religious tolerance. I think it's also true that within religious traditions, even if they think that they're pretty confident that for the most part they have it right, that there are things that you can learn from people in other religious traditions. So there's obviously these traditions have been successful in some way or other in fostering the individual or collective well-being of their adherents. And if there are things we can learn about that we can appropriate for our own purposes to make our lives better and the lives of our fellow citizens, like that's worth taking seriously.
It's funny. I'm thinking that like religious pluralism is super American, but also the humility that's baked into most religious tradition. You're small, you're one of many, you're here to help, is kind of at odds with the rugged individual who, can pick himself up by the bootstraps. And if you can make it, you can keep it.
Well, that's certainly very true. I think these are really divergent ways of thinking about the nature of success and purpose and well-being. And I think that that latter description you have is a description of how folks understand themselves as we move into an increasingly secular environment.
But it also kind of reminds me of the Buddha. Wasn't that sort of what he was doing under the tree? Was thinking like, God, I have everything a man could want, and I still don't really feel that great. What else could be going on here?
Sure. But for those who are part of the Buddhist tradition, part of the idea is to distance yourself from desire and from wanting to possess. And that has as a corollary a willingness to share and to seek the well-being of others. So I think that one thing you do find in common, and this isn't universally true, but it's generally true, is this other-orientedness or other-centeredness that that religious traditions point you towards. There's something about our well-being that's tied up with engaging with, giving to, and loving others.
I know. I love that.
But you asked the question about how is religion dangerous? And that's also a really important question. The short answer is, if there's one thing we've learned from social psychology, it's that when you divide people into groups and you tell them it's a zero-sum game, you're going to have hostility.
Yeah.
That's just an unavoidable fact about the way human beings are constructed. And so when religion becomes an identity marker where we're told that these are the people on my team and those are the people that are on their team and there's a zero-sum game, there's no way to get along at that point. And so we have to change the narrative. That's a difficult thing to do.
Before we take a short break, I'd love to thank my production partner on this series, the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, supporting inclusive higher education and healthcare, vibrant spiritual communities, and a clean environment. The Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, investing in our common future. We'll be right back. Hey guys, there's tons of things that make working out hard, but socks should definitely not be one of them. Bombas performance socks are stitched with this special moisture-wicking yarn and temperature-regulating vents that allow cool air to flow in and prevent overheating. They come with a pillow-like tab to save you from blisters, an extra layer of cushiony comfort on the bottom, and they come in different styles for every sport to help you optimize performance and keep you comfortable. I love my Bombas. I love the way they look, and I love the way they work, and I love the way they feel. So go to bombas.com/Kelly today and get 20% off your first order. That's bombas.com/Kelly for 20% off. bombas.com/Kelly. Hey guys, so we all should be eating more fish. We know this, but the seafood counter can be a little intimidating. Like you just want it to taste so good and you want to be sure about the quality. Wild Alaskan Company takes the guesswork out of buying wild-caught seafood. They deliver high-quality, sustainably sourced salmon, whitefish, or a combination right to your door. Each shipment contains individually wrapped portions that are ready to prepare and easy to cook. It's always wild, never farmed or modified, and it contains no antibiotics. And right now, you can get $15 off your first box when you visit wildalaskancompany.com/Kelly. The fish is fantastic. We eat it around here at least once a week. That's wildalaskancompany.com/Kelly for $15 off your first box. Welcome back to Kelly Corrigan Wonders and my conversation with my friend and frequent thought partner, Dr. Michael Murray. He's a philosophy professor and now the CEO of the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. And we're talking about where religion comes from, like why it even exists.
It's an interesting question to ask, like, how did people get to be religious in the first place? And the answer is really that there had to be some evolutionary benefit, right? There's some benefit to either holding beliefs of this sort or engaging in practices of this sort. And the benefit seems to be that religiosity provides us with pro-social motivations to sustain our cooperation with others and to resist the temptation to defect on others. There's a theory called the supernatural punishment hypothesis, where the idea is that as groups get larger, we lose the ability to police one another. Mm-hmm. And so what we need is something else that does the policing for us. Mm-hmm. And so if we develop these dispositions to believe in the existence of these supernatural moralizing agents, divine deities and so on, who are watching over us and whom we can't fool and who are going to punish us if we defect from the social compact, but that's good for us, evolutionarily speaking.
And that goes to narrative and how baked into us that is. You've got to come up with stories about why it's raining today and what made that mountain. I just remember being in New Zealand and hearing all their, kind of legends and myths about the landscape and thinking, of course, if you came upon this pre-written word, you would have to come up with some idea about what you were looking at.
Right. So seeing ourselves as part of something that's bigger than ourselves, it looks like it's an important corollary for social well-being and individual well-being. I mean, The research also is pretty clear that if we don't have some kind of sense of meaning and purpose in our lives, that we're just more miserable. We're more liable to mental illness. We're more liable to substance use disorders.
But interestingly, none of that makes it more true. It just makes it more useful.
That's a really good point. So you might wonder, has evolution or our brain just tricked us into something that we have to hold on to because it's useful? Or is there a reason to believe that these things are really true? I mean, we could have a separate conversation about, are there good reasons to believe that the claims of religion are true? Simply because they turn out to be useful doesn't mean that they're false.
So, we talked to these two guys that you turned me on to, Pastor Bob and Imam Majid.
Yep.
And I wondered, who do you think is doing a great job of creating space for dialogue? Like, who are the role models? What are they doing right? And what could we be learning from their ideas, their mindset, and their techniques?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I know that our good mutual friend, Ibu Patel, who leads the Interfaith Youth Corps. There are other organizations that aren't specifically focused on religion, but do include conversations about religious matters, like Braver Angels or Bridge USA. So I wanted to say something else about that, and it's this. We have to be careful, I think, not to offload responsibility for creating these opportunities for conversations across line of difference to organizations or interventions. That is, if we treat these organizations as the analog of the gym when it comes to our physical fitness, I think we're in trouble. We need to do things that weave this into the fabric of our kind of daily lives. So it's being involved in the YMCA. It's being involved in the PTA. It's being involved in things that are part of your daily life over a long period of time, where you're put in contact with people with different identities. That's the sort of thing that creates the contact and the social glue that makes a difference.
Well, that is also a big agenda item for us, which is if we popularize this little set of questions, then maybe it will help untie tongues out there. Like just among friends, if you're on a walk, you could talk about your kitchen remodel, but you could also say, who do you know in your life who's like full of faith, and what do they believe, and what do you believe versus what they believe, and just finding the words that you would feel comfortable asking that don't feel too invasive or out of the blue, but could lead to actual conversation between people of different beliefs and, people of belief and non-believers. Like that's a great conversation to have.
For sure. Somebody I know wrote this book called Tell Me More. And I think if we use that phrase more in our conversations about religion, it'd probably be beneficial for all of us. But if we can approach those that we know who hold views that are different from our own with a genuine sense of curiosity and just wanting to understand who they are because we recognize how important these beliefs are to their identity, like we would all be so much better off, and we might actually learn something.
Yeah, and it's kind of like an act of love. Like if you have real friendships, but you don't know really that much about their beliefs, like it's incomplete. Like you should want to know. That's part of who we are. It's such rich conversational territory, I think. So can I ask, there's so many of the behaviors from openness to name calling that are passed down from grandparents to parents to kids. And I wonder how we could hope to interrupt that transfer of judgment. It could be your political party, it could be race or sexuality. I mean, it works everywhere. Tell Me More always works, I will say that.
I think the challenge is that there are, when it comes to difficult topics, so many of these topics within the context of the family are important identity markers for ourselves, that things that challenge those things that are kind of identity markers can become uncomfortable. And if kids sense that there are certain topics that are off limits, or if there are certain topics that are so central to our identity that we're not allowed to question them, it ends up being harmful when they're trying to engage in relationships with other people. So if there's a way of dropping that in our interactions with each other at the family level, I think it makes kids healthier in their relationships with others and in their conversations with others. So it's learning to listen about the hard stuff. When your kid comes home and is talking about a topic that runs cross-grain with the religious and moral identity of their family, right? The easy thing to do is to react strongly against it, to just try to shut the conversation down. And we all know that ultimately that doesn't work. Right? So I think it's providing this kind of hospitable, as you said, intellectually humble environment in which we can explore, why do people think the different things that they do?
Has there been a time in American history where we were kind of particularly good at practicing curiosity and respectful dialogue?
If you're talking about eras where things were different and better, I think probably the first half of the 20th century may have been the golden era. So there was a book recently published by the Harvard sociologist Robert Putnam and a co-author, Shaylin Garrett, called Upswing. And what they do in the book is they trace the history of, you could call it individual and collective well-being on the part of the US from the mid-19th century through the present. And what they argue is that we see the same kind of divisions, isolation, polarization, fractious conversation in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century during the Gilded Age, as we're seeing today. But what happened between the 1920s and the 1960s was what they called the upswing. So it was this period of increasing positive interpersonal relationships across lines of difference, including across racial differences. It improved financial well-being on average on the part of the citizens across a variety of different strata. But something happens in the 60s where things kind of go into reverse. And we're now back at the place where we were roughly 125 years ago.
Ironically, was it war that brought us together?
That is a really good question. And I think in the book, they underemphasize the importance of having gone through 2 world wars during that period.
Because nothing works to bring people together like a common enemy.
That's not actually what they argue. I mean, they do look at a lot of data in this book, and they argue that instead, there's a pivot away from individualism and towards more a collective sense of identity. Now, it could be that world wars were in part a driver of that. They point to a lot of different factors: the rise of unions, the rise of the social gospel in the Protestant world, which of course is the majority share of the American population. So there was a move away from individualism and instead more of a focus on the social implications of the gospel and our responsibility towards one another. And so during that period of time, you find more overtures between members of different religious groups to one another than you find from the 60s onwards. So something happened, which has brought us back 125 years in terms of our progress. And so the question is, can we do something to reverse that? Can we take a lesson from what happened in the early 20th century and use that as a way of trying to generate the new upswing?
Can we?
Yeah. I think that in order to do it, we're going to have to be willing to do some hard work.
Do you think that the hunger for better days, to put it incredibly generally, is sufficient to drive change?
I think it depends on whether we get to the point where we're so tired of the situation that we're in that we're really willing to work hard to do something different. So,
enough people have to be worn out enough to tip.
Right. We have to get to the point where we're, among other things, tired allowing our eyes and ears to be held hostage by our devices and social media and thinking that that's the most important thing that in our lives, and being willing to re-engage with real people. But that takes real work. It means shutting off the television and closing the laptop and putting your device away and sitting down and actually talking to people. And that takes effort. It takes vulnerability.
Sure. I mean, this is a terrible turn of events for kids, is that they can interact in a text in a way that they wouldn't be able to do eyeball to eyeball. But I do feel like the dream of college, of this place where people go and mix and mingle and develop their ideas in person in a classroom, facilitated by people who've worked really hard to get their head around a subject, is a hopeful thing. And if we could open up college to more people, there's a real chance there to teach these conversational skills, to teach curiosity, to reduce judgment, to celebrate interaction and including vulnerability.
I totally agree. I mean, college is this incubator. It's this rare cultural phenomenon that we have that allows people from a variety of different geographic regions, identities, social and cultural strata to meet and engage with each other and to live in the same hall and to be in the same classes for an extended period of time. It's a precious resource that we don't want to squander, not just as a tool for giving people vocational training, how to live with each other.
Yes, it's so much bigger than that. And I understand that it costs way too much money. And so people have to think about ROI in really narrow career-based salary and benefits terms, of course. But if we could reduce the overall cost, allow more people to experience it, and recognize that the benefits aren't simply getting a job, but learning how to be a citizen.
That's right. And so, one thing that we all have to worry about, you mentioned Jonathan Haidt early, and one of his big concerns that he has and that the organization that he's started, Heterodox Academy, worries about is viewpoint diversity. And that is worrisome. We do have to watch out for forces that are seeking to enforce an ideological conformity within the context of the university. Because if we don't allow people to express these divergent points of view at this incubator stage, first of all, they simply they'll walk out of there with the same beliefs that they walked in with, not having had the opportunity to engage other people about it, but they won't learn how to have these conversations across lines of difference.
Right. What a sin that you would go somewhere for 4 years and you would just come out thinking the same set of beliefs. That would just be such a colossal loss.
Individuals like Miroslav Volf at Yale, who teaches this course, Life Worth Living, which looks at different religious traditions and asks students to entertain the question of whether or not they believe those things for themselves. Like, you go through each religious tradition and you ask, is that a plausible way for you to think about who you are and the life you want to live? The waiting lists for these courses are just so long that they couldn't teach enough sections. So how on the one hand do we balance that? We know that there's that appetite for this sort of thing amongst college students. And yet there's also this aversion to talking about religious topics in public. I think there is some apathy for sure. We've seen a growth in the percentage of individuals who identify as unaffiliated. The percentage has grown to, I think, roughly 17%.
But, does apathy have a negative connotation? Because I'm unaffiliated, but it's definitely not apathy. Like, I would be in that 17%, but I'm super actively engaged with the topic.
I think apathy has different meanings and has different sources. I think in cases where you have apathy regarding religion for college and university students, a lot of it arises because they actually don't see how it could become existentially meaningful for them because they really haven't seen good models of it. We've been talking about how religion is portrayed in our culture in general. And I mentioned the negative press that you get in journalistic treatments of religion. But you don't see positive portrayals of religion in media, in entertainment. So I think it's hard for people to internalize what sort of difference it might make in their lives if they don't know individuals who are devout and animated in a positive way by their religious convictions. So part of that I think is just taking the opportunity to take yourself out of your own comfort zone for long enough to sit down and talk to those who are deeply animated in this way, to better appreciate the difference that it makes in their lives and to think about its relevance perhaps for you. It's something worth taking seriously, given the individual and social benefits.
Yeah. So thanks as ever for helping me think. I love this series and I think people are going to really enjoy it.
Thanks, Kelly. I think you're bringing visibility to something that's really important and needed, and I look forward to listening myself.
All right. Bye. Here are my takeaways from talking to Michael Murray. Number 1, and not or factors into beliefs too. Any religion, like so many other things, including each one of us, can be both beautiful and appalling. 2, acknowledging that your religion may not be right in all things doesn't make you less of a believer. It just means you're still thinking. You're still human. Number 3, key to the American experiment is mixed religion neighborhoods where people actually interact regularly. Potlucks, garage sales, babysitting. It's the everyday exposure that protects us from otherizing. Number 4, the social and digital isolation we're currently experiencing is preventing us from these connections and contributing to the discord. Number 5, according to the numbers, Religion is good for us. Religious people are more generous, they have a better quality of relationships, and lower rates of substance abuse. Number 6, there's something essential about our well-being that is directly related to engaging, giving, and loving. Other-orientedness is a big part of many religious traditions. Number 7, just because it's good for us and for others doesn't make it true, and it doesn't make it false either. Number 8, according to history and social psychology, when you divide people into groups and tell them it's a zero-sum game, you get hostility. If the teams are based on religious identity, you often get war. Number 9, it's our responsibility to be in contact with people who are different and to be open to learning from them, and for baking these interactions into daily life rather than offloading them to some special organization we engage with only occasionally. And number 10, real friendships, deep friendships, involve talking about what you really believe in all kinds of situations. So let this be the beginning of people not feeling they need to keep their beliefs a secret, that they can ask and answer questions without judgment.
Coming up next on Kelly Corrigan Wonders.
I started to go on a spiritual journey because I was unhappy. Kelly, I was depressed and anxious, and that's what drove me on this path to look for some kind of spiritual solace.
Kelly gets serious with Rainn Wilson, known to the world as Dwight Schrute from The Office, about his Baha'i faith and how it transformed his life.
I want to thank Dr. Michael Murray. I want to thank the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. And of course, I want to thank the little teeny powerful team at Kelly Corrigan Wonders. That's producer Susan George, sound engineer Dean Kateri, interns Emma Broning and Margaret Faust. And finally, I want to thank you guys. I really appreciate you rating and reviewing the podcast. We are almost up to 1,000 5-star ratings, so that's kind of cool. And it really helps us be discovered by other listeners. So thanks again, as always.
From PRX.